My kids ambushed me on stage with a folder showing my $200,000 savings. It was already tabbed, highlighted, and waiting for my signature. They called it a family moment. I felt my stomach drop in front of 50 strangers. You know that hot, dizzy feeling when you realize you've been played. They thought embarrassment would make me comply. They were wrong. Big mistake. Here's what you need to know up front. I didn't cave, I didn't cry on cue, and I didn't sign a damn thing. What they didn't know, what nobody in that backyard knew, was that this moment was going to cost them access to me forever. And if you've ever been ignored by your own kids and then suddenly remembered when money's involved, you're going to understand exactly why. 2 weeks earlier, I was sitting alone in my Newark apartment, the same one bedroom I've been in since my husband died 23 years ago. Same view of the brick wall, same creaky radiator, same quiet nights. I'd gotten used to the silence, even if it still hurt. I kept busy. Grocery runs, long walks by the park, too much late night TV, and every birthday, every Christmas, every random Tuesday, I tried again. I'd call. It rang to voicemail. I'd text. No reply. I'd send a card. Nothing back. At some point, you stop expecting answers and start documenting the effort. I took pictures of the gifts I sent before boxing them up. A sweater here, a silver serving set there, a kid's bike I'd never see anyone ride. Not because I wanted credit, because I needed proof I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined 20 years of reaching out into nothing. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I checked the mail and saw an ivory envelope with gold lettering. My name was spelled perfectly. Full name, no note, no explanation. Just an invitation to a family celebration at a mansion in Short Hills that Saturday night. Formal attire. I stood there in the hallway holding that envelope like it might disappear. After all that silence, this was it. This was the door cracking open. And I know what you're thinking. Why go? Why risk it? Because hope is a stubborn thing, and when it's been starving for years, it'll take scraps. I spent money I shouldn't have. $200 on a dress, $600 on a sterling silver gift that felt appropriate for a house like that. I rehearsed what I'd say in the taxi, palms sweating, heart pounding like I was walking into a job interview I couldn't afford to fail. The house was enormous. Gated driveway, valet parking, live jazz drifting through the open doors. A housekeeper pointed me toward the backyard like I was a guest she didn't recognize, which I was. About 50 people stood around cocktail tables, champagne flutes clinking. I didn't see my kids at first. Then my daughter, Melissa Carter, appeared long enough to air kiss my cheek and say, "So glad you could make it," before drifting away. No hug, no real eye contact, just optics. That's when something in my chest tightened. I found a seat near the edge and waited. And waited. When my son Brian Carter walked in, he looked right at me, held my gaze for a beat, then turned away and joined a group by the bar. That told me everything. Hope is dangerous. If you were there, you would have felt it too, the way the room suddenly didn't feel welcoming anymore. I watched families laugh, couples toast, grandparents pass babies around. I sat there holding a gift bag that suddenly felt like a prop. Then, my son-in-law, David Carter, clinked his glass and took the microphone. He talked about legacy, about a beach house, about family building something together. People applauded. I noticed my name hadn't come up once. And then Melissa smiled too wide and said, "Mom, come up here." Every head turned. My legs felt heavy, but I stood. This was the moment, right? The reconciliation, the explanation. I climbed the steps, my heart in my throat, and that's when Brian pulled out the folder. He didn't even look nervous. He spoke like he was at work. Calm, professional. He mentioned numbers, mentioned my apartment sale from years ago, estimated my savings at around $200,000. Right there, out loud. I felt exposed, violated. He slid the folder toward me and said it would be easier to do this now, that everyone was here, that we were family. A pen appeared in his hand like a magician's trick. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. It wasn't love. It was money. What do you think? Was I right to stand there? Or was I stupid to show up? Comment below. I asked for time. They pressed. Deadlines started flying. This week. Today. Now. Melissa squeezed my shoulder a little too hard and smiled for the crowd. Something settled in me then. Cold. Clear. I said no. The murmurs started immediately. David laughed like it was a joke. Brian's jaw tightened. Melissa's smile vanished. And in that moment, I saw the truth plain as day. They hadn't invited a mother. They'd summoned an ATM. I stepped down, grabbed my purse, and headed for the exit. Brian followed and grabbed my arm near the garden gate, his voice low and sharp, warning me not to make this difficult. I told him to let go. He did. I walked into the night, shaking but steady, already making a list in my head. Lawyer, bank, new number, new life. She picked the wrong one. And you? You're going to want to hear what I did next. I didn't leave quietly, and you need to know that, because silence would have been the lie they wanted to tell later. The second my heel hit the bottom step of that little garden stage, the air changed. You could feel it ripple through the crowd. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations stalled out mid-sentence. 50 people suddenly realized this wasn't the feel-good family moment they'd been invited to watch. And here's the thing, you know that look people get when they're lying straight to your face? Melissa had it locked in. Wide smile, tight eyes, jaw clenched just enough to say, asterisk. Don't you dare embarrass me, asterisk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I turned back toward them and said, calmly, that I wasn't signing anything. Not tonight. Not ever. Brian jumped in fast, like he'd rehearsed it. He said this wasn't pressure. It was an opportunity. He said, Mom, this is how families do things. And I remember thinking how funny it was that family only showed up once money entered the conversation. That folder was still open on the little table behind him. I could see the tabs now. Neat. Color-coded. Pages already flagged where a signature would go. That wasn't spur of the moment. That was a plan. Prepared means guilty. David tried to smooth it over. He laughed and said everyone was getting the wrong impression. He said it was just an investment, that I'd always be welcome at the beach house. Which, honestly, was rich, because I hadn't been welcome anywhere near their lives in 20 years. Melissa stepped closer and put her hand on my arm. Not gentle, controlling. Her fingers dug in just enough to remind me she was steering this. She leaned in and said, through her smile, let's not make a scene. That's when it hit me how calculated this was. The crowd, the music, the timing, the pressure. They thought I'd cave because saying no in front of witnesses feels rude. They thought manners would do their dirty work. Wrong move. I looked out at the guests, neighbors, coworkers, people who'd been told this was a celebration, and I said, clearly, that I'd been ignored for decades and was now being asked to fund something I'd just heard about 5 minutes earlier. I didn't accuse. I stated facts. Murmurs started immediately. A woman near the bar frowned. A man in a blazer looked down at his drink like he didn't want to be part of this anymore. Someone whispered, did she say 20 years? Facts don't need volume. Brian's face went stiff. He said I was exaggerating. He said they were busy raising families. He said life happens. I asked him, out loud, how many calls he'd returned in the last 5 years. He didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything I could have said. Melissa cut in and said this wasn't the time or place to rehash old stuff. Which was interesting, because she'd picked the time and place to ask for money. Funny how context only matters when it favors you. I stepped back and said I was leaving. That's when David's tone changed. He said it would be unfortunate if I walked away from family like this. He said people would misunderstand. He said words like times legacy times, and times commitment, times and times obligation. Asterisk. I heard threat under every syllable. Some people confuse pressure with persuasion. I walked. As soon as I hit the driveway, Brian followed. Fast. Angry now. No audience voice. He grabbed my arm and hissed that I was making a mistake, that I was being selfish, that I'd regret this when I needed help later. I told him to let go. He tightened his grip. That was the moment something burned clean through me. Not rage, clarity. I told him, loud enough for a couple guests near the door to hear, that if he didn't let go, I'd start screaming. He released me like I was poison. I got into the taxi shaking so hard, the driver asked if I was okay. I said yes, because it was easier than explaining that my own kids had just tried to shake me down in a backyard with string lights. On the ride home, my phone buzzed twice. A text from Melissa saying we'd talk later. Another from Brian saying this didn't have to get ugly. It already was. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, dress still on, gift bag still by my feet, and I opened my phone. This is where part 2 really starts. Because once you stop hoping, you start seeing. I scrolled back through years of missed calls. Dozens. Hundreds. Voicemails I'd left that were never opened. Text messages marked delivered but never answered. Birthday wishes, holiday photos, updates they never asked for. Patterns matter. I pulled out the drawer where I kept receipts. I know how that sounds, but when you're dismissed long enough, you learn to save proof. Gift receipts with dates, shipping confirmations, notes I'd written and never gotten responses to. I laid them out on the table like evidence, because that's what they were. 20 years. 0 replies. I checked social media next. Their pages weren't private. I could see trips, parties, grandkids growing up without me. And suddenly I understood how Brian knew my savings estimate. He'd been watching. Quietly. Calculating. That made my stomach turn. I wasn't paranoid. I was late. The next morning, I went to the bank. Same branch I'd used for years. Same teller who asked how my kids were doing every time I came in. I asked a few questions, casual ones, about account privacy, about what information could be accessed and how. The answers weren't comforting. Anyway, here's the part people always ask about later why I didn't call them to work it out, because there was nothing to work out. You don't negotiate with people who already decided you're a resource, not a person. By noon, I had a notebook open on the table and I started writing. Just a list at first, short, direct, attorney, bank accounts, phone number, social media, address. I didn't know how yet. I just knew it was happening. That afternoon, my phone rang again. Brian this time. He left a voicemail saying he was sorry things got heated and that they could revisit the numbers later. Numbers, not feelings. Numbers. I deleted it. Then Melissa called. Her voice was softer now. She said she felt blindsided and wished I'd handled things differently. She said the party wasn't meant to be so transactional. That word stuck with me. Because transactions are exactly what they'd prepared. I told her I needed space. She laughed, like that was unreasonable. I hung up. Some people say I overreacted. I say I reacted appropriately to being cornered. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the folder, the pen, the way Brian said my savings amount like it was already his. I got up around 2 a.m. and started organizing everything into piles. Calls, texts, receipts, dates. And that's when I found something that made my hands go cold. A certified letter receipt from 3 years earlier. I'd sent it after my husband's death anniversary. I remembered it because it cost extra, and I'd hesitated before paying. It showed delivery. Signature required. Someone had signed for it. They'd gotten it. They just chose not to respond. That wasn't neglect. That was deliberate. I sat back in my chair and laughed once, sharp and bitter. Because now I knew there was no misunderstanding, no crossed wires, no hurt feelings on both sides. They knew I existed. They just didn't care until money showed up. I closed the notebook and made one last note at the bottom of the page. Disappear. And here's where I need to ask you something. Because people split hard on this. Would you have confronted them again? Or would you have done exactly what I did next? Because by the end of that week, I wasn't just hurt, I was informed. And what I found after that made the party look polite. I didn't cool off. And you know why? Because when someone shows you a folder with your savings amount circled in yellow, that isn't a misunderstanding. That's a plan. That certified mail receipt I found at 2 a.m, the one showing they'd signed for my letter years ago, that was my switch flipping. They didn't miss me. They ignored me on purpose. So I stopped acting like a mother hoping for mercy and started acting like a woman protecting her life. I was done. The next morning, I put on jeans, grabbed my purse, and drove straight to a little attorney's office in Newark, one of those brick buildings with a faded brass plaque and a lobby that smells like old coffee and printer toner. I picked her because she wasn't connected to anyone in my kids' world. No country club circles, no mutual friends, just business. Her name was Rachel Torres. First thing she asked was, "What's the emergency?" And I told her the truth. I told her my daughter Melissa Carter invited me after 20 years of silence. My son Brian Carter cornered me in front of 50 people, and they tried to make me sign paperwork for a beach house I'd never even seen. Rachel didn't gasp. She didn't do the dramatic pity face. She just slid a yellow legal pad toward herself and started writing. Then she asked, "Do you have proof?" I opened my phone and turned the screen toward her. Call logs, voicemail, timestamps, texts that said delivered and nothing else. I had photos of gifts I'd sent because I'd gotten into the habit of taking pictures, like a crazy person trying to convince herself she existed. Rachel nodded once and said, "Okay, we're not guessing. We're building a wall." That's what I needed. Not comfort, a wall. Here's the first move she laid out. Lock down the money trail and the identity trail at the same time. Not tomorrow. Not after one more conversation. Now. Because adults who can plan a public ambush can also plan a way to track you. Rachel asked me my full legal name. And for the first time in this whole mess, I said it out loud like it mattered again. Susan Carter. Just hearing it made my stomach twist. Because that name was tied to them, to their last name, to decades of me trying. Rachel tapped her pen and said, "If you want peace, we can get you there. But you need to be ready to follow through." I told her, "I'm ready. If we year." She didn't smile. She just said, "Good." Clean decisions. Clean outcomes. We started with paperwork. Rachel explained the name change process in New Jersey. Petition, fingerprinting, background check, notices, the whole thing. She warned me it wasn't instant. She also warned me about publication requirements, how some people have to publish notice in a newspaper unless there's a reason not to. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't want my kids seeing my new name in a public notice. Rachel looked at me and said, "We're going to ask for a waiver based on safety and harassment concerns. Not guaranteed, but we'll try." That was the first time I felt a tiny bit of air come back into my lungs. Then she asked the question that hit harder than all of it. "Do you have a will?" I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. My own kids were trying to get my savings while I was still breathing. Of course I needed a will. Rachel said, "If you don't want them touching your estate later, you need to fix that now too." So we did. That afternoon, we drafted a new will that cut them out completely. Not out of spite, out of self-defense. Rachel suggested leaving something small to make it harder to argue I forgot them, but I told her I didn't want cute tricks. I wanted final. Instead, I named a local charity that helps older women with housing and legal support. Women like me, the ones nobody checks on until they smell money. That signature felt like closing a door. Some people will say that's harsh. But if you're watching this and you've ever had someone treat you like a wallet, you already get it. The next day, Rachel had me on a tight schedule. Banking first, phone second, digital footprint third, housing fourth. And every step had a paper trail that belonged to me, not them. I walked into my bank branch on Broad Street with my stomach in a knot. The same place I'd had accounts forever. The same place where the tellers knew my face. I didn't hate them, but I didn't trust anything familiar anymore. I asked to speak to a manager. He took me into a glass office and did the friendly voice. "How can we help you today, Miss Carter?" I said, "I need to close my accounts and get cashier's checks." His eyebrows lifted. "All of them?" "All of them." "Thank you." He asked if I was switching banks. I said yes. He asked why. I said, "Privacy." He didn't push after that. He just typed. A printer word. Numbers started appearing on screen. Here's what I had, roughly between savings and a couple accounts I'd kept separate. About $215,000. Not billionaire money, not beach house legacy money, just the total of 20 years of living careful, of clipping coupons, of skipping vacations, of not buying the nicer car, of telling myself my kids might need help someday. Turns out they needed help taking it. I watched the manager slide the cashier's checks across the desk like they were nothing. Thick paper, watermark, official. My hand shook when I picked them up. This was my life in paper form. Rachel had told me not to deposit them at the new bank the same day. She wanted me to break patterns and create time gaps. So I drove to the Walmart on Springfield Avenue, bought a plain folder, and shoved those checks inside like they were contraband. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot and stared at the steering wheel for a full minute. If you've never had to protect yourself from your own family, that probably sounds dramatic. But the fear isn't just fear. It's grief with teeth. That night, I opened a new account at a completely different bank across town. New branch. New people. I didn't use my usual phone number. I didn't give them my old email. I opened a new email address that was boring on purpose. No birthdays, no names, nothing searchable. I opted out of everything I could opt out of. Paper statements only. No marketing, no shared access, no family contact. And I asked point blank, what happens if someone calls pretending to be me? The banker said, "We verify identity." I said, "Verify harder." AD. She blinked, then nodded, and added extra security questions to the file. Paranoid? Maybe. Alive? Absolutely. By Thursday, the phone started again. Brian called twice and left a voicemail. He used that careful lawyer tone. "Mom, we need to clear the air. This is getting blown out of proportion." Melissa texted, "You're hurting the family." That one made me laugh, because apparently the family existed when my no turned into a problem. David sent a message too through Melissa's phone saying, "We can talk numbers later. Just don't make this public." They were worried about optics. Not me. I stared at the screen and pictured that backyard. The lights, the folder, the pen, the way Brian said my savings amount like he was reading the weather. Then I blocked them, one by one. Tap, confirm, done. And look, blocking your kids feels wrong the first time. Your finger hesitates. You tell yourself you'll unblock later. You start bargaining with yourself like you're the one who did something bad. But the truth is, boundaries feel mean to people who benefited from you having none. Friday was the phone store day. Rachel told me to stop using my longtime number. It was too tied to me, too easy to locate through old contacts, through databases, through helpful acquaintances. She told me to get a prepaid phone and a prepaid plan and keep it separate until the name change was final. So I went to a little electronics store near a strip mall, bought a basic smartphone, and paid cash. No financing, no account tied to my social, no auto pay. I held that new phone in my hand, and it felt like a different life. New number, new rules. I went home and did the digital cleanup next. Facebook gone, old email closed. I deleted anything that had my location, my routines, my familiar places. It wasn't about being dramatic. It was about being unfindable long enough to breathe. That weekend, I listed my apartment. That one hurt. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. That little place was where I survived my husband's death, where I cried quietly so no one would hear, where I watched storms roll over Newark from my kitchen window. But it was also a fixed address, a target, a place they could show up and bang on my door like they still had rights to me. I called a realtor and told him, I need a fast sale. He asked if I wanted top dollar. I said, I want out. One, he stared at me like I was nuts. Then he said, okay. We listed it at a price that made my stomach clench because I knew it was low. But speed was worth more than pride. I wasn't trying to win a bidding war. I was trying to disappear. And that's the part people underestimate. It's expensive to run from your own life. The first open house was on a Tuesday. I sat in my car a block away with the new prepaid phone in my lap, watching strangers go in and out of my building. It felt like watching them tour a museum of my past. A couple offered within 48 hours. Not perfect, not generous, but clean. The offer was around $180,000. I said yes. Decisions make noise. That same week, Brian tried one more tactic. He called from a different number. I recognized the cadence the second I answered, too smooth, too practiced. He said, Mom, we can make this easier. I didn't respond. He added, we're not asking for 200 anymore. We're willing to do 150. There it was. The number, the audacity. He said it like he was offering a discount on a car. Like I should feel grateful he wasn't taking everything. I asked him, did you really just negotiate my life savings like this is a deal? He snapped back, stop being dramatic. And I said, don't call me that. He paused. Don't call you what? Mom, silence again. The kind that tells you you just hit the truth. Then he muttered, fine, and hung up. I sat on my couch staring at the wall, and I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. That fear had started turning into something else. Control. By the time my apartment closing came, Rachel had my documents lined up like we were building a case, not a new life. Closing disclosures. Copy of the new will. Proof I'd moved money. Notes on the name change petition. The closing happened in a plain office with stale coffee and a stack of papers so thick I thought my wrist might fall off. I signed, initialed, signed again. And when it was done, the keys hit the table with a small clink. That sound was the end of Newark for me. I walked out, sat in my car, and took a breath that felt like the first one I'd had in years. Then I drove to the shore. Not the Jersey Shore where you run into someone you know every 5 minutes. I went farther. I wanted distance that felt real. 4 hours if the traffic behaved. Bethany Beach, Delaware. A quiet coastal place where nobody cares who your kids are because nobody knows them. Where people are friendly in a normal way, not in a what do you do for a living way. Where the ocean is loud enough to drown out old voices. I found a small condo with an ocean view and a balcony big enough for a chair and a coffee cup. The realtor called it cozy. I called it safe. The day I moved, I didn't hire a big flashy company. I rented a small truck, loaded what mattered, and left the rest behind. I packed my photo wall last, and even then I hesitated. Not because I wanted to keep living in those memories, because I couldn't decide whether they still belonged to me. I took them anyway. Boxed them up, taped it shut, wrote fragile on top like that word meant anything anymore. Once I got to Delaware, I changed my routines on purpose. Different grocery store, different pharmacy, different coffee place. I didn't go posting photos of the beach. I didn't tell old acquaintances where I went. I kept my head down and lived small. Safe is a skill. A few weeks later, Rachel called and said the name change petition was moving forward. She reminded me again it could take a couple months. But she also said, start using your new name socially if you can. Practice it. So I did. My new name was Diane Owens. Saying it felt strange at first, like trying on someone else's coat. But after a few days, it started to feel like what it was, a separation. Susan Carter was the woman who begged for scraps. Diane Owens was the woman who didn't. One morning, I stood at my kitchen counter in Delaware, coffee steaming, sunlight coming through the blinds, and I realized something that made me laugh out loud. They didn't know where I was. They didn't know how to reach me. They didn't know I'd cut them off legally, financially, and socially. And that feeling, it wasn't guilt. It was relief. Then the universe reminded me not to get comfortable. A week after my name change hearing got scheduled, my prepaid phone buzzed with a call from a New Jersey area code. No name, no contact photo, just numbers. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. Then it rang again. They were hunting. And you're going to want to hear what I did with that call. That New Jersey number didn't stop calling. And you already know what that means when people can't reach you with guilt. They reach for something official. You ever get that feeling like somebody's standing outside your life with a clipboard? That's what it felt like. My little Delaware condo was finally quiet, finally mine, and suddenly my phone was lighting up like I'd committed a crime. I didn't answer the first 3 times. On the 4th call, I did something Rachel Torres had drilled into me. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened with my hand already on a pen. A man's voice, flat and practiced, said he was trying to serve legal documents to Susan Carter. He gave a callback number and said he'd make another attempt. Serve. Legal. Documents. So, yeah, they'd found a new lover. I called Rachel before I even finished my coffee. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear typing in the background like she already knew it was coming. I told her what the voicemail said. Rachel didn't sound surprised. She said, "Do not call that number back. Forward it to me. And don't open your door for anyone you don't know." Then she paused and added, "Susan, this is them trying to drag you into their story again." That phrase hit me hard. Because I'd finally stopped being the character they could move around. I forwarded the voicemail, and then I waited. That afternoon, I drove to the grocery store in Bethany Beach, nothing dramatic, just milk and bananas, and I came back to find a man standing by the mailboxes in the lobby. Early 40s, neat hair, polo shirt, clipboard. He looked up too fast when he heard the front door. That's not a neighbor. He stepped toward me like he'd been waiting. He smiled and said, "Susan Carter?" My skin went cold. I didn't answer. He tried again. Polite but pushy. "I'm looking for Susan Carter. I have documents for her." I held my keys tight in my fist and said, "Wrong person." He glanced down at a sheet on his clipboard, then back up at me, and I watched him do the math in his head. Age, face, hesitation. He said, "Ma'am, are you sure?" I smiled, like I belonged there. "Positive." He kept his smile and said, "If you're Susan Carter, I'm required to." I cut him off. "I'm not." End quote. Then I walked past him like I didn't feel my heart trying to climb out of my throat. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I kept it normal on purpose. I went straight to my unit, locked the deadbolt, and stood there listening to the hallway like I was 16 again, hiding from trouble. They found the building. That was the near-death part. Not physical death, but the death of peace, the death of anonymity, the death of me thinking I could just quietly slip away and live like a regular person. Rachel called 15 minutes later. She said, "He's a process server. It means a lawsuit or a petition of some kind. We need to see what it is." I asked her how if I refused to accept it. She said, "They can still serve you if they can identify you, or they'll serve by alternate means if a judge allows it. Hiding isn't a plan by itself." That's when I felt that old panic rise, the one I hated, like I was about to get scolded for not cooperating. And then I got mad at myself for even thinking that. They don't get to chase me. Rachel told me to stay inside and send her a description of the guy. I did. I also pulled up my condo association's online portal and requested security footage from the lobby camera for that time window. I used my new email and my new name where I could. Diane Owens. My fingers still felt weird typing it, but I did it anyway, because this wasn't just about a case. It was about identity. That evening, the condo manager emailed me back and said they could provide footage if law enforcement or an attorney requested it. So I forwarded that to Rachel too. Receipts. Always. Then the text started again. Not from their old numbers, those were blocked. These came from random numbers with New Jersey area codes. Short messages that pretended to be polite. One said, "Mom, please call me. It's urgent." Another said, "We don't want to do this. Don't make us. Don't make us." Like I was forcing them to sue me. I stared at my phone and felt that hot pressure behind my eyes that people mistake for tears. It wasn't sadness. It was rage, trying to stay civilized. Some people only respect you when you're scared. Rachel called the next morning and said she'd gotten a copy of the filing through the court's online system, Essex County. I sat down so fast, my knees actually bumped the table. She said, "It's a civil complaint." And I said, "For what?" Rachel exhaled and said, "They're claiming you made an oral promise to invest in a property, then backed out. They're alleging damages. They're asking for a judge to enforce an agreement." I let out a laugh that didn't sound like me. An oral promise at a party I was invited to as a surprise. Rachel said, "Exactly. It's weak, but it's not nothing." Then she added the part that made my mouth go dry. They attached documents. Attached documents. That backyard folder wasn't just a prop. It was the beginning of a paper trail designed to make me look like the bad guy. Rachel emailed me a PDF. I opened it and my hands started shaking so hard I had to set the phone down on the table. The filing had my full legal name in bold, my old Newark address, my old phone number. And the plaintiffs listed were Melissa Carter, Brian Carter, and David Carter, all three of them. Family business. Their complaint told a story where they were the victims. It said they'd been planning a family investment property to bring everyone together. It said I'd expressed enthusiasm, had agreed to contribute, and then refused without cause, causing them financial harm, like I'd stolen something from them. And then I saw the exhibit they attached an email printed out like it was proof. The email was allegedly from me. It said, "I'm in for $150,000. Let's do it." It squinted. My stomach turned over because I never sent that. I don't even write like that. I write like a woman who over-explains and uses too many commas. That email sounded like a man drafting a business deal. Rachel said, "We're going to challenge authenticity. But listen to me, do not contact them. Not once." I didn't want to contact them. I wanted to drive back to New Jersey and throw that printed lie in their faces. But revenge without strategy is just a tantrum. So, yeah, I sat there breathing through my nose, staring at that fake email, while Rachel explained what we were going to do. Response deadline, motion practice, possible sanctions if the judge thought it was frivolous, and how New Jersey judges don't love when adult children try to shake down a parent with half-baked paperwork. That helped. A little. Then came the first gut punch of real fear. If they could forge an email, what else could they fake? I went back through my own records. Old email accounts, archived messages, sent folders. I searched keywords like in, for, beach, investment, $150,000. Nothing, which is what we expected. But still seeing nothing didn't calm me down. It made me realize how easily someone could manufacture proof if the other side wasn't careful. Rachel told me to screenshot everything and send it to her. So I did. Then she told me to freeze my credit. That day, she told me to pull my credit reports from all three bureaus, lock them down, and watch for new inquiries. Because the kind of person who forges an email doesn't stop at one lie. I went online and froze my credit. It took 20 minutes and about 5 different security questions. I answered things like what street I lived on 15 years ago and what lender held a car loan I'd forgotten I ever had. It was annoying and surreal and necessary. Then I pulled my reports, and there it was. A hard inquiry from a mortgage lender in New Jersey, dated 2 weeks after that backyard party. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. They weren't just suing. They'd been trying to use my name. I called Rachel and read the lender name out loud. She went quiet for one beat, then said, "Okay." This just became something else. That sentence? That's when I stopped feeling like I could handle it with normal legal steps. Because a lawsuit is one thing, But messing with someone's identity and credit? That's a different level of reckless. Here's what Rachel did next. She sent a preservation letter to the lender, demanding any application records tied to my name. And she requested the IP logs and any recorded calls. She also told me to file a police report for suspected identity fraud. That's not dramatic. That's how you get leverage. So I drove to the local police department in Delaware, small building, big flag out front, quiet lobby. A young officer at the desk asked what I needed, and I said, I need to file a report for identity fraud. He looked at me like he expected a scam story with a fake IRS caller. I told him the truth. My adult children were suing me, and I found a mortgage inquiry I didn't authorize. I showed him the credit report printout. The officer's eyebrows rose, and his tone changed. He took me into a little interview room with a metal table and asked for details. Names, dates, addresses, phone numbers. He typed while I talked. Saying my kids' names out loud in a police station is a special kind of humiliation, by the way. It's the kind you feel in your teeth. But I did it anyway, because I wasn't protecting their reputation anymore. He gave me a case number. He told me they'd take a statement and could coordinate with New Jersey if it crossed jurisdictions. He didn't promise miracles, but he documented it. Paper beats pleading. On the way home, I sat in my car and stared at that case number on the little printout. You know that moment when your life feels like it turned into a file? That was me, a woman in her 60s, sitting in a Delaware police parking lot, filing a report on her own kids. Some people will tell you family is everything. Okay. Then explain why they're doing this. Rachel and I spent the next week moving fast. She filed our response to the complaint. She challenged the so-called email. She demanded discovery metadata, devices, server logs, everything. She requested communications between the three of them that referenced me and money. Rachel said, if they forge something, they'll panic the second we ask for technical proof. And she was right. 3 days later, Rachel called and said their attorney reached out to discuss settlement. Settlement. Already. That's what guilty looks like. Their attorney's name was Mark Wilson. He had a downtown Newark address and the kind of voice that sounded like it came with a golf membership. He told Rachel they wanted to resolve this privately, and he suggested a modest contribution to avoid unnecessary conflict. Rachel asked him, modest compared to what? Mark said, compared to what litigation costs. Rachel laughed one short, humorless burst and said, if your clients have real evidence, they wouldn't be scared of litigation. And Diveritz's. Then she asked him point blank about the mortgage inquiry and whether his clients had applied using my information. There was a pause. Just long enough. Mark said, I'm not aware of that. Rachel said, you should become aware. Quickly. And then she did something that made me love her. She sent him the police report case number. She didn't threaten. She informed. That night, my new phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it without listening, but something told me to play it. It was Melissa. Her voice wasn't soft this time. It was sharp and angry and shaking. She said, you think you're so smart. You think you can disappear and make us look like monsters. Call me back. This is not over. Not over. That voicemail was a gift because it wasn't a mother-daughter message. It was a threat. I forwarded it to Rachel with one line. Save this. Rachel replied immediately. Already did. It's doesn't. A couple days later, I got a certified letter at my Delaware address. Somehow they had it. Maybe through old forwarding information, maybe through a skip trace, maybe through someone I used to know who thought they were being helpful. The envelope was thick. Legal size. Court return address. My hand shook opening it. And you know why? Because you can brace for anger. You can brace for insults. But official paper has weight. It changes what you can ignore. Inside was a notice of hearing date in New Jersey and a separate letter from Mark Wilson suggesting mediation. Mediation. Like we were divorcing. I called Rachel and said, they found me. Rachel said, they found an address That's not the same as finding you. She asked me to scan everything and send it. Then she said, Susan, listen, they can file all day. But if we can prove they forged that email and tried to open a mortgage line, the judge will bury them. End quote. That should have made me feel better. It did, for about 5 minutes. Then Brian did the thing that almost broke me. He showed up. Not at my condo, thank God, but at my workplace because I'd taken a part-time job at a little gift shop near the boardwalk. Nothing fancy, just something to keep my days structured and give me a reason to talk to normal people. The owner, a sweet older woman named Carol, called me into the back room with her phone in her hand and a worried look on her face. She said, "There's a man here asking for you. He says he's family." My whole body went hot. I walked out and saw Brian standing by a display of seashell magnets like he belonged there. He looked around, smiled at Carol like he was harmless, and then his eyes landed on me. He said, "There you are," just like that. Like he'd finally located a lost possession. Carol asked if everything was okay. Brian gave her a smile, so polished it made me sick, and said, "We're just gonna talk." I looked at Carol and said, "No, we're not." Then I walked right up to Brian and said, quietly, "Get out." His face tightened. He said, "Mom, you're being ridiculous." I didn't flinch. "Leave, right now." He lowered his voice and said, "You think a name change is going to save you? You think hiding in Delaware fixes anything?" That's the line that told me how deep they'd been digging. Because he didn't say moving. He said hiding. He wanted me to feel hunted. I glanced at Carol, and her eyes were wide. She wasn't nosy. She was scared for me. So I did the most American thing a woman my age can do when a man refuses to respect a boundary. I got loud enough to attract witnesses. I said, "You're trespassing. Get out of this store." Brian's head snapped back like he'd been slapped. He looked around and realized customers had paused. Carol had stepped closer. Another employee peeked from behind a rack. Brian hissed, "Don't do this." End quote. I said, "I already did." He tried to get close again, and I stepped back, put the counter between us, and said, "If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." His eyes flashed. Then he put his hands up like he was the victim and said, loud enough for the store to hear, "Fine. I was just trying to talk." He walked out with his shoulders stiff, like I'd embarrassed him. Good. After he left, Carol locked the door for 10 minutes and made me sit down. She asked if I wanted her to call someone. I told her I had an attorney. She nodded like she'd seen enough life to understand what that meant. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Honey, people who love you don't chase you like that." Exactly. Would you have called the cops right then? Be honest. Because a younger me would have avoided the scene. I would have swallowed it and cried later. Diane Owens didn't swallow anything. That night, Rachel told me to write a statement about Brian's appearance at my workplace and send it with Carol's name as a witness. She said, "If they keep contacting you directly, we may need a restraining order." That word restraining order still made me feel like I'd failed at motherhood. But I reminded myself, restraining orders aren't for strangers. They're for people who won't stop. The next morning, I checked my condo mailbox and found another letter. Not from a court, from a mortgage lender. My hands started shaking again. The letter said they needed additional verification for an application. An application in my name. Rachel got on the phone with their fraud department while I sat there staring at the ocean through my blinds, listening to her do what she does, calm, precise, deadly. She gave them my police report number. She demanded the full application file. She demanded the recorded call, if there was one. Then she asked for one specific thing, the email address used on the application. The lender rep read it out loud. It was an email address I'd never seen before, but it contained one word that made my stomach flip. Carter Coastal. Carter Coastal. They didn't even try to be subtle. Rachel didn't say a word for a second. Then she asked the lender rep for the mailing address on the application. It wasn't my Delaware condo. It was a New Jersey P.O. box. Rachel hung up and said, "Okay, now we're going to win." I stared at her through the phone like she could see me. "How?" She said, "Because they got sloppy." That P.O. box is traceable, and the lender will have ID documents attached. If they used your name, they had to submit something. Driver's license, copy, social security number, something. My skin crawled. They don't have my social security number. Rachel said, "You'd be shocked what people can get when they've known you your whole life." I nodded instead. That was the second near-death moment. Realizing the enemy wasn't outside the house. It was the people who knew where you kept the spare key. Rachel told me she was filing an emergency motion in the civil case to compel preservation of digital evidence and to notify the court about suspected identity fraud connected to the plaintiffs. She said, "Judges hate games. We're going to put this in front of him." I spent that whole day in a state where I couldn't sit still. I cleaned the kitchen twice. I walked the beach in a windbreaker with my hands shoved in my pockets. I watched families build sandcastles and felt like I was watching another species. Then, around 6:30 p.m., Rachel called. Her voice was different, tight, focused. She said, "Susan, I got something from Mark Wilson." I said, "What?" She said, "He sent me a screenshot." I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. A screenshot of what? Rachel said, "A group text." My throat went dry. "Between who?" Rachel didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Between your daughter, your son, and your son-in-law." And it references the fake email and the mortgage application. My whole body went cold and hot at the same time. Rachel said, "Mark thinks he's helping them. He thinks he's sending me leverage for settlement. He doesn't realize it's evidence of fraud." I couldn't speak. She continued, "The screenshot shows Melissa telling Brian, 'Mom won't sign. Use the email and push the lender. She'll fold.'" Then Rachel read the next line, and it made my vision blur. David wrote, "If she hides, we serve her and freeze her options." Freeze her options. This wasn't family conflict. This was a coordinated plan. Rachel said, "Do you understand what this is?" I whispered, "A confession." Rachel said, "Exactly. And now I have the weapon." I sat down hard on my couch and stared at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt this heavy, clean certainty settle in. They weren't misunderstood. They were predators. Rachel said, "I'm filing this with the court with a motion for sanctions, and I'm calling the lender back to request the full file. If that screenshot is real, they're done." I swallowed, finally finding my voice. What if they deny it? Rachel said, "Let them. Denial doesn't erase metadata." Then she added, "And Susan? Stop thinking like their mom. Start thinking like the person they tried to rob." I held the phone against my ear and listened to the ocean outside like it was applause. Game over. They just didn't know it yet. Case dismissed. And the exhibit on the screen was Melissa's group text saying, "Use the email." That's how my day started in the Essex County Courthouse, my adult children staring at a judge while their own words hung up on a monitor like a bad tattoo. And you know what I felt in that moment? Not sadness, not guilt, relief. The kind you feel when somebody finally says out loud what you've been living through. Some things can't be repaired. Rachel Torres met me in the hallway outside courtroom 412 with a manila folder tucked under her arm like it weighed nothing. She had on a navy suit, hair pulled back, and the calmest face I'd ever seen on a person who was about to light someone up in public. I kept my hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup like it was an anchor. It was barely 9 a.m. and my stomach was already a knot. Rachel leaned close and said, "Stay calm. Let them talk. They're going to hang themselves." You've seen people walk into court thinking it's a stage. That was Melissa and Brian. They showed up dressed for a fundraiser, not a hearing. Melissa had a crisp blazer and pearl earrings. Brian wore a suit that fit like it had been tailored yesterday. David stood behind them, shoulders back, chin high, like this was about honor. They didn't look scared. They looked offended that I dared to defend myself. We walked into the courtroom, and the air hit me, the way it always does in those places. Old wood, old paper, cold, AC. The judge sat up there like a mountain. Not mean, not warm. Just done with nonsense before it even started. When the clerk called the case, I stood up with Rachel and said my name for the record. And this is where the first punch landed. The judge looked down at the paperwork, then up at me and said, "Miss Owens?" My heart stuttered. Rachel had already filed my name change documents in the record, and the court had updated it. That's when I realized how public this was, how final it was. Brian's head snapped toward me so fast I could practically hear his neck crack. Melissa blinked like someone had thrown sand in her face. David whispered something to Brian, and Brian's lips tightened. Good. New name, new rules. The judge asked Rachel to state the defense position, and she didn't waste a word. She told the court this lawsuit was a pressure tactic. She said the alleged oral promise was nonsense. She said the supposed email was disputed, and she said there were signs of identity fraud connected to a mortgage inquiry filed in my name. Then she did the thing that made the whole room shift. Rachel said, "Your Honor, we also have evidence of coordination among the plaintiffs to fabricate proof." End quote. Fabricate. That word makes adults sit up. Their attorney, Mark Wilson, stood and tried to act like he wasn't sweating. He said the plaintiffs were simply seeking fairness, and that the family had been estranged for complicated reasons. Complicated reasons. That's lawyer talk for, we don't want to say the real reason out loud. The judge asked for testimony. The courtroom got quiet. Melissa went first. She took the stand like she was stepping into a spotlight. She looked straight at the judge and told a story where she was the long-suffering daughter with a difficult mother. She said I'd always been needy. She said I made everything about myself. She said she couldn't keep up with my emotional demands while raising a family. Then she tried to make it sound noble, like she'd been protecting her peace. And here's the part that would have worked on the wrong day. With the wrong judge, Melissa kept repeating, "It's not personal. It's just life. If dan none." She said it like a slogan. Rachel stood up for cross-examination and didn't even glance at me. She looked at Melissa like she was reading a receipt. Rachel asked, "How many times did you call your mother in the last 5 years?" Melissa hesitated. "I don't have an exact number." Rachel nodded like, "Sure, fine." Then she said, "We do." Rachel walked to the clerk and handed over printed phone records and screenshots. Real ones. Dates. Times. The kind of boring proof that's impossible to argue with. She asked permission to approach the witness, and the judge allowed it. Rachel placed a stack on the stand and said, "These are your mother's outgoing calls to you. Hundreds, over years." Melissa's face tightened. Rachel flipped one page and said, "This page alone shows 19 calls in 1 month. No answer." Melissa tried to shrug. "I was busy." Isidio. Rachel said, "You were so busy you couldn't return a single call?" Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. Rachel kept going. She pulled up screenshots on a monitor, messages from me that said things like, "Happy birthday, honey. I'm thinking about you. Please call me back." And then nothing under them, just delivered. Rachel asked, "Is there a reason you never replied?" Melissa said, "I didn't see them." Rachel didn't react. She just tapped the screen and said, "These show read." That little detail sucked the oxygen out of the room. Melissa's eyes flicked toward Mark Wilson, and he looked down at his notes like he'd suddenly developed a deep interest in paper fibers. Rachel asked, "Do you recognize this gift receipt?" And she held up a printout. Melissa said, "I don't know." Rachel read the amount out loud. $250. A shawl, shipped to your address, signed for. Melissa's jaw clenched. Rachel held up another. $600 sterling silver flatware set. Purchased 2 weeks before the party. Do you remember receiving it? Melissa said, "I don't." Rachel cut in, calm as anything. "You don't remember, but you remember the beach house investment." Ouch. Then Rachel asked about the last time I'd seen my grandchild. Melissa tried to dodge, but the judge asked her directly. So she answered. She admitted it had been years. Rachel nodded and said, "Your Honor, we also have an incident where Miss Owens attempted to meet the baby at a door threshold and was refused entry." The words sounded weird in court door threshold because it was so small and so cruel at the same time, but it mattered. It was proof the neglect wasn't accidental. It was chosen. Melissa's cheeks went red. Rachel asked, after 20 years of silence, "Why did you invite your mother to a formal party in Short Hills?" Melissa said, "We wanted to reconnect." And, Rachel asked, "Then why did you have paperwork ready for her signature?" Melissa's eyes widened. "It wasn't like that." Rachel turned slightly and said, "Let's talk about the folder." Melissa started talking faster, like speed could cover facts. She said it was an opportunity. She said everyone was contributing. She said it would have been a family legacy. Rachel asked, "Did you ask her privately?" Melissa hesitated. "We asked her at the party." "Hey, I know for going." Rachel said, "In front of 50 witnesses." Melissa swallowed hard. Rachel asked, "And you demanded roughly $200,000? Melissa snapped, "We didn't demand." Rachel lifted one sheet and read from party notes we'd compiled, plus witness statements from 2 guests who'd reached out afterward because they were disgusted. Rachel said, "Your brother stated her approximate savings on a microphone." Melissa didn't answer. Rachel stepped closer and said, "Is public pressure ever family?" Melissa's eyes flashed. "She embarrassed us." Rachel didn't flinch. She said, "No." That one word landed like a brick. Done. The judge told Melissa she could step down. Melissa got off the stand looking smaller than she walked up. She avoided my eyes. Brian stared at me like he wanted to burn through me with his glare. Big mistake. Brian took the stand next. He tried the polished tone. He talked about responsibility. He talked about supporting each other. He tried to make it sound like I'd promised them money, then pulled the rug out. Rachel asked him, "When did your mother make this promise?" Brian said, "Over the phone." Rachel asked, "What day?" Brian hesitated. "I don't recall." Rachel asked, "What time?" Brian said, "I don't know." Rachel asked, "So you can't name a day or time, but you can name her account balance?" Brian's face tightened. "That's not what I said." It was. Rachel held up the exhibit and said, "At the party, you referenced her savings. That's in witness statements. Where did you get that information?" Brian tried to play offended. "We just had a sense." Rachel leaned forward just a fraction and said, "Try again." Brian looked at the judge, then back at Rachel. His voice got quieter. "We looked things up," Rachel asked. "What things?" Brian said, "Public info." Rachel said, "Bank balances aren't public." Brian swallowed. Rachel asked, "Did you apply for a mortgage using your mother's identity?" Brian's eyes widened, like he couldn't believe she'd said it in open court. "No." Rachel nodded. "Okay, then you won't mind us requesting the application file." Brian said, "That's insane." Rachel didn't react. She just said, "That's a no to cooperating." Brian clenched his jaw. Then Rachel did the move. The one that changed everything. She asked the judge for permission to show an additional exhibit. The screenshot Mark Wilson had sent over like it was leverage. The judge approved it. Rachel walked to the monitor, and there it was big enough for everyone to read. A group text thread. Melissa's name. Brian's name. David's name. Rachel read it out loud, slow and clear, like she was reading a verdict. Mom won't sign. Use the email and push the lender. She'll fold. Even no, if she hides, we serve her and freeze her options. I heard a few small gasps behind me. Courtrooms don't usually do dramatic reactions, but that hit people in the gut because it was so cold. The judge leaned forward. Mark Wilson stood up fast and said, "Your Honor, I object." The judge said, "Sit down." Mark sat. Rachel turned to Brian and asked, "Is that your phone number in this thread?" Brian stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. Rachel asked again. Is that your phone number? Brian said, clipped. Yes. Rachel asked. Is that your wife's number? Brian said, yes. Rachel asked. And this is your text message? Brian hesitated, then said, yes. Melissa's face had gone pale. She was staring at the screen like she wanted it to disappear. Rachel asked Brian, so you admit you discussed using a fake email and pushing a lender? Brian snapped. It wasn't fake. Rachel said, then prove it. Produce the original email with metadata. Whenever using. Brian didn't answer. Rachel asked, and what does freeze her options mean? Brian looked at the judge, then back at Rachel like he was searching for an exit. He said, it was just talk. Rachel nodded once. About committing fraud. Brian's face flushed red. Rachel asked the judge to note the police report case number I'd filed in Delaware and the hard inquiry on my credit report. The judge looked irritated now. Not at me, at them. The judge asked Mark Wilson, counsel, did you advise your clients to pursue a mortgage application in the defendant's name? Mark stammered, no, Your Honor. I wasn't aware. The judge said, you are now. That was the beginning of the end. David took the stand, like he could fix it. He tried to act like the reasonable one. He said they were worried about me. He said they wanted to take care of me. He tried to spin the whole thing into concern. Rachel asked him, if you were worried, why didn't you answer her calls? David said, that was between her and the kids. Rachel asked, then why are you in the group text talking about freezing her options? David's eyes flicked to the monitor, then away. Rachel asked, and why did you show up at her workplace in Delaware? David said, I didn't. Rachel paused. Your brother-in-law did. We have a witness. David's face tightened. Rachel didn't hammer him with 10 questions. She only needed 3. Because 3 solid facts beat 30 emotional speeches. Then the judge called a short recess. Rachel and I stepped into the hallway. I leaned against the wall because my knees felt weak, not because I was losing, because my body was finally letting go of months of tension. Rachel looked at me and said, you're doing great. I shook my head. This is surreal. Rachel said, no, this is accountability. When we went back in, the judge didn't waste time. He looked at Melissa, Brian, and David like a disappointed teacher, and he said there was a clear pattern of abandonment and opportunism. He said they ignored me for years, then approached me for money in a public, coercive setting. He said the lawsuit appeared designed to intimidate. Then he said the line that felt like the world writing itself. Case dismissed. He dismissed it with prejudice, meaning they couldn't just file the same garbage again and call it a new complaint. End quote. Mark Wilson looked like he might pass out. Melissa started crying. Quietly at first, then harder when she realized no one was rushing to comfort her. Brian's face was tight with anger, but his eyes were flickering. That's what panic looks like on a man who's used to control. David stared straight ahead like he was trying to mentally leave his body. The judge wasn't done. He warned them directly to cease contact. He said if they continued to pursue me, show up at my residence or workplace, or harass me through third parties, they could find themselves facing harassment charges. Leave her alone or face charges. Then he looked at Mark Wilson and said he expected counsel to advise the plaintiffs accordingly. Mark nodded so fast it looked painful. Rachel requested attorney's fees and sanctions based on the apparent fabrication and abuse of process. The judge didn't grant everything on the spot, but he did order a hearing on sanctions and instructed the plaintiffs to preserve all devices and communications related to the disputed email and any mortgage application. That's court speak for, don't you dare delete anything. It was the kind of order that makes people sweat through expensive suits. And then the judge said something that wasn't strictly legal. It was personal, and you could tell it came from a place of disgust. He said, you don't disappear from someone's life for 20 years, then reappear with paperwork and a handout. He looked at them and added, that's not family, that's opportunism. I didn't even realize I'd started crying until Rachel touched my elbow and handed me a tissue. It wasn't sobbing. It was just release. Like my body finally believed I wasn't crazy. Afterward, in the hallway, Melissa tried to rush up to me. Her mascara had smudged. Her hands were shaking. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. She said, "Mom, please." I stepped back. She blinked like I'd slapped her. I didn't mean. I cut her off, low and steady. "Don't." She tried again. "We can fix this." I stared at her and said, "You can't fix 20 years with a lawsuit." She flinched. Brian came up next, jaw tight, trying to salvage pride. He said, "You think you won? Fine. When you're old and alone?" I looked right at him and said, "I was alone the whole time." "It's a var." That shut him up. David muttered something about how this didn't have to get ugly, like the courtroom hadn't just read his own threat back to him. Rachel stepped between us and said, "All communication goes through me." Then she added, "And if you contact Miss Owens again, we'll be filing for a restraining order." They backed off. Denial, panic, defeat. That was the full progression, right there in a courthouse hallway. On the drive back to Delaware, my hands were steady on the steering wheel for the first time in a long time. The sky was gray. The traffic was annoying. I stopped at a rest area, bought a stale pretzel, and sat in my car watching families shuffle in and out like normal people. And the weird thing was, normal didn't make me jealous anymore. Normal made me grateful. By the time I got back to Bethany Beach, the ocean wind hit my face like a reset button. My condo smelled like clean laundry and lemon cleaner. I kicked off my shoes, stood on the balcony, and just listened to the waves. Quiet isn't loneliness when you choose it. A couple weeks later, Rachel called and said Mark Wilson had withdrawn as counsel. Not dramatic, not emotional, just gone. Then she told me the lender had opened a fraud investigation into the application connected to that New Jersey P.O. box. She didn't promise criminal charges. Those things take time, but the file existed now. The paper trail was real. The lenders don't play with fraud. Financial consequences. Social consequences came next, and I didn't even have to chase them. Word travels fast in the kind of circles my kids like to live in. Lawsuits, court rebukes, judges calling you opportunistic in public. People get quiet around you after that. They hate mess when it's attached to their name. And here's the salt in the wound: they lost the beach house deal, not because of me refusing to invest, because lenders don't love hearing the borrower try to drag a parent into it with disputed documents and a fraud investigation hovering in the background. Their legacy turned into a liability. Some people call that karma. I call it math. 6 months passed without a single call. Not one, "How are you?" Not one, "I'm sorry." Just silence again. The old familiar silence. Except this time, the silence felt clean. I made friends in Delaware. Real ones. Not the kind who smile at you because of your last name. I started having coffee on my balcony most mornings and walking the beach after work. I went to a little community center potluck where nobody cared about my past, just whether I liked potato salad. My neighbor Betty, 70 years old, loud as a horn, heart of gold, threw herself a birthday dinner at a seafood place right off the highway and invited half the building. She raised a glass and said, "To new beginnings, even when they're overdue." I laughed so hard I almost choked on shrimp. Chosen family. That's the real legacy. Then, 3 years later, a package showed up. No return address. Just my Delaware address and my new name, written carefully on the label, Diane Owens. My hands went cold because my body still remembered threat in cardboard form. Inside was a letter, Melissa's handwriting. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she'd been selfish. She wrote that she didn't know how things got so bad. She wrote that she missed me. And tucked under the letter was something wrapped in tissue paper. A small necklace from my childhood. The one my mother used to make me wear for church on Sundays. I hadn't seen it in decades. I didn't even know they had it. I held it in my palm and felt my throat tighten, not because I wanted to run back to them, but because it was proof they'd kept pieces of my life while pretending I didn't exist. They always knew where to find my soft spots. They just didn't deserve access to them. So I did something that probably looks cold from the outside. I put the necklace back in the tissue paper. I folded the letter once and slid it back into the box. And I carried it into my closet and set it on the highest shelf, behind old blankets and a spare set of towels. No dramatic reply, no forgiveness speech, no reunion. Peace stayed where I left it. Maybe you'd forgive after 20 years, maybe you wouldn't. But I'll tell you this, any apology that arrives after a lawsuit isn't love, it's regret. Case closed. If that ending felt good, hit subscribe. I've got more stories like this. And if you love Karma with Receipts, subscribe because I don't forget.